Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. We're not sure where you're joining us from. I'm sure multiple time zones. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lorrie Faith Cranor to the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Capstone seminar. She will be discussing, well, her talk is going to be on designing usable and useful privacy choice interfaces. So this is probably the first time that I can use this phrase and do so sincerely. It is that I'm going to provide a quote unquote potted bio because Dr. Cranor is very accomplished. So she's done many things. So she did us the favor of providing us a short bio um, that only briefly captures all the great things that she has done. So Dr. Cranor is the director and Bosch Distinguished Professor of the SciLab Security and Privacy Institute and Ford Systems University Professor of Computer Science and of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. There she directs the CUPS Lab, which stands for SciLab Usable Privacy and Security Laboratory. And she also co-directs the Privacy Engineering Master's Program. In 2016, she served as the Chief Technologist at the US FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. She co-founded Wombat Security Technologies, and she's a fellow of many organizations, including the ACM, IEEE, AAAS, and a member of the ACM Chi Academy. There are many things that the bio did not cover. For example, I was reading that she has a video that played on Delta Airlines about her work on passwords. But anyway, if you would please join me in welcoming Dr. Cranor, and I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. So today we'll talk about designing usable and useful privacy choice interfaces. As was mentioned, I wear many hats at CMU and advise both PhD students and master's students. And the research that I'm going to mention was conducted with lots of these students and some of my colleagues as well. So to start with, what do I mean when I say privacy choice interfaces? So it means lots of things. One of the interfaces we see a lot, unfortunately, is cookie banners that are prompting us to make choices. If you use social media, there are audience controls. Do you want your post to be public or just to your friends? When we download mobile apps, we have app permission interfaces. There are also interfaces to provide third-party advertising controls, marketing opt-outs. In California, we have the CCPA Do Not Sell My Personal Information interface, and there's also the GDPR privacy rights interface. All right, so lots of privacy choice interfaces. They're everywhere, but they are often pretty difficult to use. Sometimes they're hard to find. We can't find where the controls are in an interface. Even if we can find them, we find out what the choices are, and it's really difficult to understand what each choice does. Sometimes it's many clicks to get to where you want. Sometimes they're deceptive. They have what is often known as dark patterns, and they may not actually offer the choices that people are looking for. And I was just talking about the web. What about IoT devices? Where do we even put choice interfaces on a drone that might be flying around, or a smart light bulb in the ceiling? Where do we put choices so that we can see it and interact with it? And so that becomes problematic. In our research at CMU on this topic, we have been trying to find ways that we can actually put people in control over their personal information. So I'm going to talk about a few things today in kind of a whirlwind tour. We're going to talk about privacy policies, but going beyond those traditional long privacy policies. We're going to talk about some of the research we've done on privacy choices in IoT. We'll talk about privacy icons, and we'll talk about some guidelines for how to evaluate whether we have good interfaces or not, and how we applied them to cookie banners. All right. So we've all seen traditional privacy policies. They basically look like this. They're really long. And they started emerging on the scene for websites back in the 1990s. And right away, people realized what the problem was, that they're too long and full of legalese. And people started saying, maybe we can try something different. How about something more like a nutrition label? Nutrition labels are very short and compact, and they're standardized. So once you learn how to read them, they all are the same, and you can go from product to product and be able to get good information from it. So this was suggested actually to the Federal Trade Commission. There were regulators who were giving speeches and saying, we need privacy labels that look like nutrition labels. But none of these people were actually drawing pictures of what these labels would look like. So my students and I started looking at nutrition labels and noting some of the key features, and we came up with some ideas for designs. So back in like 2008, 2009, Patrick Kelly and my students at the time worked on coming up with designs. We tested them with consumers and focus groups and surveys, and came up with these designs. And you can see we started with a black and white nutrition label, but we added color. And the idea here was to help people see at a glance the types of information being collected and how it would be used, and kind of how much, the quantity of information at different websites. Then we looked at the idea of, well, when I do a search for a product or an online vendor, it would be great if I didn't even have to click through to all the web pages and pull up those privacy policies, privacy labels. I could just see in my search results how good their privacy is. So we did this mock-up of a search engine that was for shopping, and you can see there's the price on one side and the privacy information on the other. And we gave people money and we asked them to go shopping online, and we found that having that privacy information, people actually took that into account, where they would not consider privacy if they didn't have it in the search engine. And in fact, we did a version like this that in the search engine, you didn't see the privacy information. It wasn't until you clicked on the link and actually went to the website, and then you would see the exact same privacy information at the top of the website. But at that point, it was too late. People ignored it. We've also seen that there are some versions of privacy nutrition labels that exist in the world, and the place that you see them most often is at banks and financial institutions in the United States. So most banks have privacy notices that look like this. They send them to you in the mail once a year. They can choose whatever colors and fonts they want, but it's basically the same format for the notice. And you can see it's a nice table where there are lists of data practices that are typical of banks, and they have to say yes or no as to whether or not they actually do these things. And this is useful for a consumer to look at, but let's say that your bank has a policy, you look at it and say, oh, I don't like that. Maybe I should switch banks. You'd have to go one by one to each bank and check out their policy. But we can do better than that. So my students wrote a crawler that went and collected these policies for over 6,000 banks, put them all in a database, and made a search engine. And so now I can search by zip code, and I can find out if there are other banks that maybe better meet my privacy needs. So we have a demo of this online. It's not up to date. The data is several years out of date at this point, but you can see kind of the proof of concept of how this can work. Then we looked at mobile apps and how to make users more aware of those privacy issues. So we developed a privacy facts label that we imagined would go in a mobile app store. We did a mock-up of this for an Android app store, and we wanted to see whether users would actually take advantage of this. So we did a user study where we invited people to the lab, and we said, you know, imagine you have a friend who just got their first smartphone and they've asked for some help picking apps. And we showed them our mocked up app store, which had pairs of apps in different categories, and they had to evaluate each pair and tell us which app they would choose for their friends and why. Half the people saw our app store with privacy facts, and the other half, privacy facts was not in there. And what we found was without privacy facts, nobody actually had privacy being one of the criteria that they considered. But with privacy facts, it became an important criteria. It wasn't the only one, Sometimes people would see a pair of apps and say, oh, I've used this one, so I'm just going to recommend it without paying attention to privacy. Or they'd see, oh, this one has a very high rating, so even though the privacy isn't so good, I'm going to go by that high rating. So privacy isn't everything, but when you make it salient like that, it can be part of the equation for people when they make these decisions. All right, so that was back in 2013. We did that study. We showed it to the major app platforms. They didn't do anything with it until 2020, when Apple announced that they were going to actually put privacy labels in their mobile app store. And shortly thereafter, Google announced that they were going to do the same thing. So we have two different versions, one for iOS, one for Android. And we were very excited to see that they were going to do this. But as we started looking at the details and what was actually in their labels, we grew concerned about how useful they might be to consumers. One of the things that we observed is that they said things that didn't seem like they were necessarily accurate. So we did a study with developers to find out whether developers were properly creating these labels. And so we had 12 iOS app developers, and we watched them as they created labels for their apps. And what we found is that most of them made errors. A lot of it had to do with not understanding the privacy terminology that Apple was using. And a lot also had to do with forgetting about the data collected in third-party libraries. So they didn't write those libraries, they didn't think about them when they were disclosing their data practices. Just to show you how complicated this is for a developer, these are screenshots from what the developer would see when they create a label. So first, they have to answer questions about whether their app is collecting data according to Apple's definition of data collection. Then they have to look at 32 different types of data and individually indicate which of those they actually collect. Then for each data type, they have to select from 6 different data purposes. Then for each one, they have to indicate whether the data is linked to users according to Apple's definition, and whether the data is used to track users according to Apple's definition. But the problem is that that's a lot, and most of the developers didn't actually sit there and thoroughly read those definitions because, well, there were a lot of them, and also they had preconceptions about what a lot of these terms meant, so they didn't think they needed to read the definitions. Unfortunately, there are words like track, and some developers who saw the word track thought it meant location tracking, and some thought it meant user behavior tracking, and some thought it meant bug tracking. But actually it means linking data with third-party data for targeted advertising or advertisement measurement purposes. Most of the developers didn't realize that that's what it meant, and so therefore they made erroneous disclosures about the word track. So that was a big problem. You can see here that the list of all of the definitions for developers is quite long, and it's no wonder that most of them didn't bother scrolling through and reading all of this information. Okay. To make matters worse, developers who had figured this out for iOS, then when they turned to their Android apps, they would discover that, in fact, there were differences, and that, in fact, there were even terms that mean different things on the two platforms. So, for example, the word collect in the Google universe means transmit data off the device, whereas Apple says it is both to transmit the data off the device and to store it. So if you don't store it, you don't have to say you're collecting it for Apple, but you do for Google. And this caused additional confusion. That was from the perspective of developers. Then we went and looked from the perspective of users. So we interviewed 24 iPhone users, and we showed them labels from 2 different apps, DoorDash and Chipotle, so both food-related apps. Most of them said that they were unaware that the labels existed and had never seen them. And that's probably because in order to find them in the Apple App Store, you have to scroll quite a bit. It's not anywhere near the top. But when we showed it to them, they said, well, that's pretty cool. I think I would use this now that I know that it's here. And then we had them take a look at these and answer questions. And what we found was that they were confused as well. They also didn't understand the terminology, and they were also confused about the structure of the label. And were frustrated that they would see things in the label that they didn't like, and they would say, well, where's the button so I can opt out? And in some cases, there is a button to opt out, but it's not in the label. It's in a completely different interface that you would have to go navigate to. Again, with the confusing terminology, the word track was again confusing, and there were some unfamiliar terms to users like identifiers, user content, diagnostics, and they really didn't like the term other data, which they saw and they thought was probably hiding the stuff that they weren't supposed to know about. As far as the structure, in order to go through the whole label, you have to scroll quite a bit. So I'm showing you here 2 columns of scrolling, and it's off the screen here. And what users would do is they would scroll through it and they'd say things like, oh, look, location. They're collecting location. Oh, look, they're collecting location again. Wait, here it is again. Boy, this seems really redundant. And what's going on here is that, yes, the word location appears multiple times, but that's because location is being used for multiple purposes. Here we see location is being used for third-party advertising. It's also being used for product personalization. And users were not understanding that. In reality, what we have here is a list of data types, and we have a list of purposes. You can imagine a matrix, that would have data types, data purposes in a big matrix. But that's not what these users were presented, and they didn't understand that that's what was going on. So in progress right now, we are working on a study with Android users. We're finding a lot of very similar things that we found with iOS users about their confusion about terms and things like that. The Android label also has some security information. Some users don't understand that, others do actually appreciate that. And we also found that in the Android one, in order to reduce scrolling, they have this accordion interface where you can click on those little triangles and open and close the interface and see more information. But what we found is that when you looked at an app, you might have like a dozen of these things, and users would click on 1 or 2 and then stop. So they were not actually even seeing all of the information. Right, so we have a lot of recommendations for app platforms. They need to improve the label accuracy by having tools for developers and automating so that developers don't have to figure this all out on their own. They need to do things to make the labels easier for consumers to understand. One idea that we have is to actually take that matrix and show consumers that, make a table view instead of these long scrolling lists. We're in the process of prototyping that and doing some testing with consumers. And then we also need to make them easier to find and use. So we suggest that the labels be more prominently placed in the App Store and integrated with the opt-outs and the app permissions interfaces rather than a completely separate interface. I have a paper in the November CACM about all of this. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about IoT. As I mentioned, IoT is a problem for these sort of privacy notices and privacy choice interfaces because of the lack of screens or very small screens. Where do you put this information? So it has been suggested that the solution is you should have sound and light to notify consumers that data is being collected. So we see that on cameras when the light is on, it's recording, things like that. And that can be very useful. But in an IoT world where you walk into a building and in the room there may be a dozen different IoT devices, you can imagine a whole cacophony of blinky beepy things. And I know that there's a lot of recording, but I don't know where data is going. So it's not a complete solution. So we thought, well, what if all of those things, instead of just beeping and blinking, they were transmitting a consumer readable, a machine readable privacy notice that the consumer's smartphone or smartwatch could pick up. So my watch now gets the message that says there are 12 different devices that are collecting data in this room. And running on that watch, I have software, and we like to call it a personal privacy assistant. And the privacy assistant is looking at it, and the privacy assistant doesn't start, yelling at me, oh, there's 12 smart light bulbs in this room. But instead, it looks at these devices and says, okay, well, what data are they collecting? What are they doing with that? And my device might know that I personally am okay with smart light bulbs. That's fine. I'm okay with smart thermostats. But if there's a microphone recording me in the room, I want to know about it. And so it will ignore everything until it says, oh, there's a microphone. And then my device will vibrate. And if I pick it up, it says, there's a microphone in this room. Watch what you say. Even better would be a way for me to say, turn that microphone off and have my device transmit that and turn it off. That may or may not be feasible, but that's the kind of vision that we have. And we've done some prototyping of this at CMU. So here's an example of an app at CMU that my colleague Norman Sade and his students developed, where you can walk around campus and find out about the IoT devices on campus that are near you, and then you can drill down and find out, all right, what is this thing? So here, there's this research project in the hallway that shows you pictures of yourself and your skeleton as you walk down the hall. What's up with that? And I can click on it and find out who owns it and what data they're collecting and what they're going to do with it. Similarly, Norman Sade and his team have put together this Internet of Things portal, which allows you to register your IoT devices so that it will be picked up by the system. And they've also gone and collected public lists of things like public video cameras and things like that and added it to their database. Right. Another issue that consumers have with IoT devices and privacy is that it's very difficult when you buy a device for your own home to get one that's going to have good security and privacy. So, you read in your newspaper or see on the news that there are hidden microphones in Google's Nest and things like that. How do I find out about this? Well, it's difficult because if you go online to try to purchase an IoT device, you can get all sorts of information about the device, the color, the style, the mounting bracket, all sorts of things. But usually there's no information about security or privacy. Some products have a little bit of information. Google products actually do have some information now. So the larger manufacturers do have some information, but it's not standardized, and in each product you find it in a different place. So it's hard to do that as a comparison. So we did some work on, could we come up with this privacy and security nutrition label for IoT devices, and would it be helpful? So we started with a study where we talked about these to consumers, showed them some mock-ups, and asked them, would this help you when you purchase your devices? And consumers said, yes, we want this. We asked them, well, what specifically do you want? What do you want to know about security and privacy? And they said, we're not experts. So we went and talked to experts and asked them, what should consumers know? We collected a list of 47 factors, decided that would overwhelm consumers. And so we developed a layered label, which I'll show you in a minute, that has a consumer view that has a subset of those factors, and then an expert view that has all of them. Then we did a study to find out whether consumers could use the label to figure out whether a particular product was more or less risky and inform their purchase decisions. And we found that, in fact, they can. And then we wondered, well, the products with better security and privacy, what if you had to pay a little bit more for them? Would consumers do that? And we did a study to find out, and we found out that most consumers would. And then finally, we looked at, well, what if we had a search engine when you search for your products, besides comparing their features and what network they're on and things like that, you could also compare security and privacy. Would that be helpful? And we found it would. So this is a mock-up of the labels that we developed. So in the middle, we have what we call our level 1 overview label. So this is what we imagine that most consumers would look at. And this might be on the packaging. Or if that's too big to fit on the packaging, we might have a smaller, what we call level 0 label, which you see on the left on this smart video doorbell packaging. And then you could scan the QR code to get the middle label. And then if you're an expert and you want even more detail, you could scan the QR code and get the label on the right that has even more detail. So this is something that we have been working on for a number of years, written a whole bunch of papers about, and we've been talking to industry, but hadn't had a whole lot of interest until recently. And there has been an increase in interest in that recently due to interest from the White House, and they held a summit on it. And so that we are now part of industry working groups who are working on trying to come to some sort of consensus on what this should look like so that it can be adopted. This is an example here that our students put together of a search engine where you could compare these products side by side. Okay, in a different project, but related, the Federal Communications Commission was charged by Congress with coming up with a label for IoT, not for IoT, for internet broadband for consumers. And so if you want to decide, should I have Verizon, should I have Comcast for my home internet broadband service, could we have a standardized label to let people compare these services? And so we did a study with Consumer Reports and came up with a proposal for broadband facts. And this is what this looks like. All right, I want to talk about privacy icons, because often when we talk about, oh, privacy policies are so long, people say, well, couldn't we just have a few symbols, a few little icons, make this easy? Or maybe we could have an icon to tell people when data is being collected. So this blue triangle icon that you see here is a very common icon that we have on ads. And this is used to indicate that these ads may be tracking you. And it's called the ad choices icon. And it was introduced at this point, I think 13 or 14 years ago. So it's been around for a while. And when it was introduced, the advertising industry was very pleased, and they said, you know, we're really making this very transparent and easy for consumers to understand when they might be tracked by ads and give them options of opting out. And what we were seeing in our research is that consumers didn't understand this at all. So we did a big online study with over 1,500 participants, and we showed them ads and we asked them questions. So for example, we showed them an ad that had the icon with the word ad choices. And we said, what would happen if you clicked on the icon? And we gave them a bunch of possibilities and they could choose more than one. 56% of people said that if you click on this, more ads will pop up, right? That's wrong. And that's also a good reason why people won't click on it, because they think that if they click on it, they're going to get more ads. They don't think it's going to actually help them protect their privacy. 45% of people said it was like a your ad here thing. You can buy an ad, which is also wrong. Only 27% of people had the correct answer. That'll take you to a page where you can opt out of tailored ads. So that's really problematic. So we tried, well, what would happen if we put different words next to the icon? So if we put configure ad preferences next to the icon, we have considerable improvement. Now, we still only have 50% with the right answer, but that's a lot better than 27%. And this just goes to show you that the ads that you put next to the words that you put next to the icon really make a difference. And that if you want to get this right, you're going to have to actually work at it, not just include the first thing that you came up with. So we applied this later when we saw in 2019 that the state of California had adopted the California Consumer Privacy Act. And among other things, the CCPA included a requirement that websites have a link that says, "Do not sell my personal information," and optionally a button or logo next to that link. And so we said, I wonder what that icon on the button or logo, what is that going to look like? And we wanted to do a user study to see if it made sense to consumers. So we reached out to the California Attorney General's office to ask them about it. And they said they hadn't decided what that was going to look like, but they had an open public comment period. So we decided that within the 90-day public comment period, we were going to design some icons for them and test them and figure out what they should do. So it's just a lot of work to do it in 90 days, but my students, especially Hannah Habib, were very helpful in getting this done. So we started by brainstorming different types of icons, and we focused on icons that might help represent the idea of choice and consent, also the icons that might represent the idea of opting out, and the icons that literally would represent "do not sell my personal information." Then we turned these over to some design students and asked them to make them pretty. So here are 3 of their choice and consent icons. Here are 3 of their opting out icons. And here are some "do not sell" icons that they came up with. In addition, we looked at the privacy rights icon that the advertising industry put together. This is identical to the blue icon that I showed you, but it's green, and apparently it means "do not sell my personal information" when it's green. We were a little skeptical, but we figured we'd test that too. So we did a study using crowd workers. We had 240 people, and we tested 12 icons. Half the people saw them with the tagline "do not sell my personal information," and half of them saw them without the tagline. They would see one icon at a time. We asked them what would happen if you click on it, and then we'd show them all 12 and ask them which one they liked better for conveying these choices. So the first thing we found is that without words, people were just generally confused. So once again, we see the importance of putting words next to the icons. Then we saw that for best conveying choices about personal information, this kind of stylized toggle was best. And for best conveying "do not sell," this /$ was best, although it also conveyed a lot of misconceptions related to payments. We found that the opt-out icons just generally confused people. And people didn't recognize this black thing with a dollar octagon is actually a stop sign, maybe because it wasn't red. So then we refined some of these. We added color. We did another test. Here are some examples of interpretations we had when we did not have the words next to it. We can see that the toggle, now a blue toggle, people got that it was related to a choice. It did not convey privacy directly, but they got that it had to do with a choice. The DAA icon was confusing. They thought it was like a play button for an audio device, maybe. And the /$ mostly conveyed things about payments or money. It was confusing. All right, so then we put all this together on a mock-up of a website for selling footwear. We put it in the bottom of the website. We put "do not sell my personal information," or we had other taglines we also tested. We put them next to it. And so we were able to do a test in context. And from here, we found, once again, there were misconceptions. And now, especially because it was in context, sometimes they thought it conveyed information about shoe sizes and payments on the site. We also found, once again, without the tagline, the icons weren't very good. So after doing all this testing, we recommended to the Attorney General's office that they adopt this blue stylized toggle. And we suggested that it would be better to put the word privacy options next to it than do not sell my personal information. And we thought, over time, there's going to be other choices besides do not sell my personal information. And so privacy options would allow us to have one button you could click and get all your privacy choices in one place, and hopefully not just in California, but in all of the country and maybe around the world. However, the law as written says it needs to be do not sell my personal information. So we recommended this. And shortly thereafter, the Attorney General said, we're going to do an icon that looks sort of like a toggle, but it will be red and it will look a little bit different than yours. And we thought this was interesting, but we were concerned that their icon would be misleading because it looks an awful lot like, common toggle switches that you see on the internet. And so we did another study. Other people were concerned as well. We did another study. We tested ours against theirs with some variations. We swapped the colors. We found that having a big X or a little X didn't really matter, but the style overall made a huge difference. And the red one was a lot more confusing. So, from what we see here is you have to actually run the study. You have to do the test to find out whether this is actually going to work with consumers. So we submitted this to the Attorney General. They retracted their red icon proposal, and they said, we're going to come back to this. And then they sent us some other icons to test, and I'm not going to go into detail here. We tested them, but the bottom line was that their icons were so bad that they were better off with no icon. The only thing that was useful with having one of these misleading icons was that it drew people's eyes, it drew their attention to the link. So time passed and they decided to use our icon. So this was really exciting. But it was an optional icon. And for a couple of years, even though it was the official icon, it didn't actually show up anywhere. And then at the end of last year, we started seeing it showing up. We saw it on like Toyota and car websites, and we saw it on paper towels and all sorts of consumer products, cereal. We saw it on clothing websites. So what's going on? Why did it suddenly start appearing on websites? Well, what happened was California passed some new privacy laws. And now they were asking websites to have more than one link. They had multiple privacy choices that they wanted offered. And so they said, instead of having to have multiple links, you can have an alternative opt-out link, just one link with your privacy choices and the icon, and you've got it all in one place. And so this was indeed appealing to companies. And so this went into effect just a month or two ago, and we're starting to see this pop up all over the place now. Okay, last bit of what I want to talk about is how do we systematically evaluate these sorts of privacy choices, and show you in the context of cookie banners. So we thought about, what is it we're evaluating? What makes for a good usable privacy consent interface? And based on our literature review and our own work, we came up with 7 things that we're aiming for. Okay, we want to, first of all, address user needs. These have to be the choices that are useful to users. It should be easy, minimal effort. Users should be aware of what all their choices are and how to find them. They should understand what all their choices mean. Users should trust them. They shouldn't feel like, oh, I can make this choice, but they're not actually going to do what I asked for. If a user clicks the wrong button, makes a mistake, or even changes their mind, there should be a way to change their decision. And we want to avoid nudging users to do the less privacy protective things. So we don't want those dark patterns. So let's look at how this applies to cookie banners. Here are lots of cookie banners. You've seen them all over the place, and they tend not to have the choices that users want. They tend to nudge you to do things like accept all cookies, right? So this is not, an equal choice. This is saying accept all cookies, do the more privacy invasive thing. And a lot of these have extra steps. So if I don't want to accept all cookies, I have to click cookie settings. And once I get to the cookie settings page, who knows how many different buttons I'm going to have to press in order to not accept all cookies. So as we were looking at this, we saw that a lot of these banners look the same. And a lot of this is because there's something called a consent management platform, a CMP. And these companies provide services to websites and say, hey, we'll run your cookie banners for you. And they have many options, some of which are really nice and privacy friendly, and a lot of them aren't. And it seems the websites often default to some of the less privacy friendly options. So we decided to do a study of this, and we tested 12 different variations on cookie consent banners. So we mocked up a website that sells cups and drinkware. We recruited people and we told them to help us test our new website. We wanted them to go there, select a cup, put it in their shopping basket. And when they did that, they would get a cookie consent banner. And actually all we really cared about was what they did on the cookie consent banner. We actually did not care about the cups website, but they didn't know that. And then after they were done, we asked them questions about the banner. So this is an example of one of our better banners that actually has clear choices, including all of the choices right there. You don't have to click through to another banner in order to find out what your cookie choices are. And then this one was one of our worst ones. This is the bottom of the screen. You can scroll past it. It has only one button, OK. If you want to do something other than do whatever OK does, you have to find that little link to cookie preferences and click through and find out what's there. And then another one that didn't work so well is this one. It has that little cookie preferences button on the right side. And you don't actually even see the banner unless you click the cookie preferences button. This is not very common, but we have seen it on real websites. And so we wanted to test that kind of extreme version. Right, so this graph shows the 12 different versions that we tested. Each row represents what users did as far as what cookies they accepted in each condition. And so what you'll see is there's a bunch of conditions here at the top that about a third of the people accepted only strictly necessary cookies and about 2/3 accepted all cookies, right? And these conditions were all very similar. They had some small changes to the text, but the buttons were all basically the same. And we see that these small changes don't make a whole lot of difference. Most of these are not statistically significant. Right. And then we have this group at the bottom with the big green bars where most people accepted all cookies. And these were the ones that didn't have all the options. You had to click through to get the options, and nobody wanted to click through. They clicked the one big button, which was to accept all cookies. And then we have these purple bars. These people did nothing. They just ignored the cookie banner, scrolled past it, and went about, putting cups into their shopping cart. And basically we found is that, when you put that little button in the corner, everybody ignores it. Okay, so we see that the absence of having any sort of inline options definitely leads to lower investment in decision-making and people just saying, I'm just going to click the button and move on with things. We also saw that the cookies have names. They're usually called performance cookies and functional cookies and things like that. And so we asked people, well, what is a performance cookie? What is a functional cookie? And we gave them multiple choice. They only had to choose between 4 choices. And most people got it wrong. And in fact, worse than chance got it wrong because it turns out that these names are actually kind of misleading and people don't know what they mean. And so we're doing a study right now to see if we can come up with better names that will be intuitive for people. We did a second study where we re-implemented our Cups and Such website. This time we actually did it as an HTML website, and we used a CMP to generate the banners rather than mocking them up. And we let people use both their computers or their mobile devices. So here's an example of what we call our baseline interface in the second study. And you can see we have all the cookie choices right there in one interface. And we also have an X in the corner because we've noticed that a lot of these banners have an X in the corner to close the interface. And we wondered, what do people think it does? What are they intending to do when they click that X? We also added an interface where you could click on a plus sign and get a definition of all of these cookie categories. We wondered, if we show people the definitions, will they understand them? Will they even look at them? And then we experimented with what happens if we have different numbers of buttons here. Okay, so what we found, and I'm just going to show you a few highlights so I don't have time to go into details, is that when we had the X in the corner, people were confused by it. We tested this both in the US and the UK. We found, first of all, that people in the US were more likely to click the X than people in the UK. And we think that's because the banners in the UK, if they follow UK law, they're actually not allowed to have the X. So they're not in the habit of using it. Whereas in the US, people are very much in the habit of using the X. We also found that people using mobile devices were more likely to accept all cookies, probably because it was a lot easier to find and hit that button on a mobile device than any of the other choices. We also found that users in the US were more positive about the cookie interfaces than the UK, probably because in the UK, they've had these interfaces longer, they have more of them, and they are really getting tired of them. Most importantly, though, we found that the initial options, once again, had the largest effect on consent behavior. So when we show all options up front, we have a lot of people who do something other than accept all. But when we only show the accept all as the big button and you have to dig down deeper to see other things, well, most people just click the big button or they click the X and close the banner. But once again, we see the close button is confusing. Some people told us they thought that clicking the X means they do not accept cookies, and others thought it means that they do accept cookies. So consumers didn't know what that meant. We found that if we showed people definitions, they didn't read them. There was no point in showing it to them. They didn't read them. We really need to have those intuitive terms. Right, so we recommend, first of all, get rid of that X, that close button, not needed, and it just confuses people. Similarly, we need to let people know what will happen if you scroll past the banner and don't do anything. We need to make sure that we have buttons both to accept and reject cookies on that first banner screen. And we need to have standardized and more intuitive terms for cookie categories. And we need to make these things work well on mobile devices too. And we hope that those CMP companies could promote more usable consent interfaces by default. All right, the last thing I want to say about these consent interfaces is we can redesign those cookie consent interfaces to be a lot better, but they're still bad because we don't really want to have to deal with this interface at every website we visit. It would be much better and much less burdensome on the users if we have tools built into our web browsers so that we can say up front, like a user agent, like I showed you for the IoT devices, these are the things I like, these are the things I don't like, just make it happen. And then you could override on an individual site basis on those rare cases where you needed to. So we'd really like to see more of that going forward. All right, I'll leave you with just a few takeaways and a photo of some of the students who contributed to these projects. So hopefully you have seen by now, privacy interfaces suffer from lots of usability problems, exacerbated by small devices, small screens. We really need to standardize our disclosures and our choice mechanisms to make this easier. We need to have them machine readable, we need to automate, and we need to evaluate with users to find out whether they actually work. And I'll end it there and take your questions.
Yes, great talk. Thank you, Dr. Cranor. So if you have a question, please, you're welcome to type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand or turn on your video, whatever you prefer. I did have some questions, Dr. Cranor, because I mean, this was a very informative talk for me, because I'm kind of guilty, as I'm sure many in the audience are, that you just kind of click on the X or you hope things go away, right? But let me table my question real quick, because we have a question from the audience, but I will ask away in a second. So we have Murat, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you for the great talk as usual. So my question is that you briefly mentioned that people are willing to pay for extra privacy. And I actually did it myself recently. It turns out that I needed to pay for my insurance more because I refused to download an app for my car insurance. But I wasn't sure whether it's really that common and whether it's really about your social status or your knowledge and so on. And therefore, as a person who do on data privacy and security research, I'm kind of thinking that maybe for many people, there's not incentives. Could you a little bit shed light on what you found out and how it can be really maybe generalized? Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there are a lot of people that don't have the luxury of paying more for privacy. They need to spend their money on subsistence, and having privacy being a luxury is not really how we want the world. We really want everybody to be able to have privacy. So in our study, we were focusing on people who purchase IoT devices. And I would say that's an elite group to begin with. Like your average person, low-income person, is not going to be purchasing an IoT device to start with. So among people who purchase IoT devices, and our study was with crowd workers, so these people are not necessarily, they're probably not high income, but they at least have a computer to be able to use to do crowd worker studies. We find that these people have a range of education. So there's some who are well educated, but there's some that are not well educated, but they at least have some technical facility to participate in crowd worker studies. We were not able to actually sell them devices and find out would they really pay that way. So we looked at what economists do to get as close to that as you possibly can without actually having to exchange money. And we designed what's known as an incentive compatible study, where we told people that we were not going to pay them to do the study. Instead, what we were going to do is, if they did our study, we were going to give them a coupon for a substantial discount when they buy an IoT device. So this ensured that only people who either wanted to waste their time or who actually were in the market to buy the device and therefore would find a coupon valuable would do our study. In our study, we gave them comparisons of devices that varied based on their privacy and security, and we would vary the size of the coupon that we would offer them and the total payment that they would have if they were going to buy this. And we said, well, if the privacy one was $5 more, which one do you want? And usually like, oh, I would pay $5 more. Okay, what if it was 10? What if it was 15? What if it was 20? At what point do they say, no, it's not worth it to me, I'll just get the lower privacy one? And so that's what we did. And then at the end, after it was all over, we were like, oh, just kidding. We're sending you $30. We're not actually giving you a coupon, right? So that's how we figured it out.
Great. Looks like we have a question from Myron Wong at DHS headquarters, privacy office. The question reads, is it possible to receive a copy of today's presentation slides? I believe we have to check with Dr. Cranor. Dr. Cranor, do you want to answer that now or later, perhaps offline?
Yeah, I can make my slides available to you all, and yeah, I'll let you figure out how you'll distribute them.
Well, thank you for doing that. Do we have other questions right now from the participants? Okay. I was going back to what I was discussing earlier. I had the recent experience of setting up the Google Assistant. I'm sure people have this experience. And I remember there was just so many questions like, hey, do you want to share the photos? Do you want to share the location? Do you want to share this and that? Like, you're going to miss out on this type of feature if you don't put this. Like, I feel like you're just completely unprepared to tackle that kind of situation as an individual consumer. do you have you guys worked on this type? I know you mentioned that maybe there can be an agent or something, but do you have some kind of guidance to guide people based on their, I don't know, comfort level on the privacy side for how to set these things?
Yeah, no, it's a big problem. Yeah, that's why we'd like to have agents involved. In general, I would say, it's usually okay to go ahead with the more privacy, less features settings. And then when you run into something, you're like, why doesn't this feature work? Oh, I have to turn this thing on. Turn it on once you figure out why you need it. That tends to be the strategy that I use. We're actually doing some other research right now where we're looking at that kind of onboarding scenario where you all at once have to make 20 different choices, and trying to see how we can make that process easier for people by perhaps bundling some settings together and letting people take some presets and say, okay, these are the settings that tend to be more privacy but fewer features, right? And seeing what that looks like. But that's work in progress, and we don't yet have kind of what our recommendations are.
Yeah, no, thank you. That would be very helpful. I have to apologize to Simpson Garfinkel. He asked a question. Dr. Garfinkel's question is, can we build this kind of privacy usability into toolkits used to build apps and websites? And if so, is it happening?
Yeah, it would be nice if we could. So just like, we've been looking at the CMPs, and we would really like the CMPs to improve their templates so that, people who are using their services just get the more privacy protective one. But you could imagine other types of toolkits like website building and apps for consumers. We actually have some of the students who worked on those mobile app studies have developed some developer toolkits for app developers that would make it much easier for the app developers to build the privacy features in and to properly build their app privacy notices. So yeah, I think that's where the direction that we need to head in.
A lot of promising directions. So we have a few more questions here. If you do you mind staying, let's say, for another 3-4 minutes or so to address?
Yeah, that's
them?
fine. Yeah.
Thank you. What was the age range? This is from Veronica Handorf. What was the age range of your participants? Are older individuals even more confused by icons?
Yeah, so in most of our studies, we have a minimum age of 18 and no maximum. And we try our best to get a good demographic range. So we do have, a concentration of people in their 20s and 30s, but most of our studies do include people in like the 60, 70 age range as well. I don't think we were able to detect any specific differences based on age, although I'm not sure our samples were big enough that we would necessarily have been able to detect it if they were there. I think one of the biggest things that comes up, though, is just vision. And as your eyesight deteriorates, distinguishing little icons becomes harder and harder.
True, valid, very valid. Next question is from Jia Hong. She really enjoys the talk, and she was wondering, it says that it seems that you work mostly on websites and desktops or laptops. Have you considered privacy interfaces on small devices like smartwatches?
Yeah, so we've looked also at phones, but we have not looked at smartwatches yet. But it's a great point, and it's going to be even harder on a smartwatch. I think for some of these interfaces, you're going to want, the watch is usually paired with a phone, and so some of these things you're going to want to go to the phone to do because it will be hard to do on a watch. But there are other things that perhaps you can do on a watch, or you do a voice interface. We've dabbled a little bit, but haven't done a full study yet with the idea of a voice interface. Right now, if you talk to Siri or Alexa about privacy issues, last time I checked, they refer you to use your phone interface. Like they don't want to talk to you. They're like, here is the URL for your setting, right? They don't really want to talk to you about it. But it seems like if you're talking to Siri, you should be able to talk to Siri about the privacy settings too. And figuring out how to do that in a way that makes sense, I think is an open research question. Interesting.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of interest here. One question I had, I don't know if you thought about it in terms of like the next frontier or whatever, like, is OpenAI, for example, like capturing all the, I'm sure they are they capturing the data that you know of, from our prompts to ChatGPT and these kind of language models?
Yes, and that's already a problem. And it's a problem both for personal privacy, but also for companies that may have corporate proprietary information that's getting captured. So some of these are now including modes where you can say, don't capture anything that I send you.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it's just it seems like you guys have done a lot of work, but there's so much out there. There's so much out there, and it's very important. Well, thank you very much. If there's no other questions, then I think we can. Oh, I guess we have one last question. What's the easiest way to get involved with this research as a student researcher?
Yeah, well, so best is to find faculty at whatever institution you are at who are interested in this. You can show them some of these papers and say, hey, can we do a project like this here? So I definitely recommend that. For undergraduate students, we actually have a program at CMU called Reuse, Research Experiences for Undergraduates in Software Engineering, that students from other universities can apply for to come visit us in the summer. And in fact, some of the students who worked on this are Reuse students. Great. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities out there. Just have to go and talk to some faculty. Thank you, Dr. Cranor. Somebody had raised their hand. I don't know if it was if they meant to ask something else or if that's it, but I guess we're running a little bit late. May you rename that program. Let's take that question offline, Amrit. I think we've gone a little bit over. So want to thank you very much again, Dr. Cranor. It was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Hey, thank you. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.